Chuck Beck, Lazarus Recovery YouTube at the junction of faith and recovery. I did a video, big long patched together video on change, and I've decided that I'm going to break it into pieces, and it turns out I told stories, and I'm going to break it into those individual stories, and I'm going to talk about change from individual stories. So this is one of the first. So I'm going to do a little series on change, break it up, because I had a lot of stuff to talk about and not a lot of time to talk about it. And I had some technical problems, and it didn't work, and maybe the Lord was telling me just shouldn't do it that way. So this time I've had the appropriate hat on, and I'm going to talk a little bit, some stories about the Navy, and particularly about boot camp. In 1960, I graduated in 68 from college, and in June of 68, and I ended up going to the Navy in September of 68 because there was no real choices back then. I graduated from college, and normally as a geologist I'd go to work for the oil companies, and any Vietnam worries would be taken care of because I'd be deferred. But it turns out right at the time I graduated, those deferments didn't come through, and so basically I called the draft board, and they basically informed me that I'd be drafted by September, October of 68. So, I checked around with my relatives, since it looked like military was going to be in my future, whether I particularly wanted it or not. And so I checked with my uncle, and my uncle was, coincidentally, he was a tech at a chemical plant, but he'd gotten his training in the Navy in World War II as a technician for fire control, which was, I didn't know any of that. Turns out he was in a lot of action at the very end of the war with the kamikaze attacks on aircraft carriers and stuff like that. And he was on an aircraft carrier, and I actually have a yearbook of that, and I might put that with the video, some prints of that with the video. But he was turns out by some sort of weirdness, I signed up for electronics, and it turns out my rate that they gave me was fire control technician, which is the same as him. Very, very weird coincidence. But the story I want to tell about change is about boot camp. In September, I remember as if it was not yesterday, but it was. I was a young kid. I was 22, and I was ordered to report on the 16th of September. I'll always remember the 16th of September. And on 16th of September, I got up and I took my cheapy bag with my cheapy stuff that would get mailed back to my folks, and I caught the train in Needham to downtown, and then to someplace military in downtown Boston, and they processed me, and then they put me on a plane for Chicago. And I'll never forget the, I was numb, basically. I'd never been in any kind of situation like that. I didn't even know what I was getting into. I just knew that I was freaked out, but I was numb, and I just went through it. And we got to the base, and they have movies of people yelling and screaming. Well, it turns out that the people that were yelling and screaming were just service weeks. They were just recruits too, and I didn't know that. They were yelling and screaming. Nobody else there yelled and screamed at us, but these guys did. And we went through a bunch of stuff, and I ended up in the main recruit camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. And the reason I talk about it is that they taught me something I had never learned before. And it has a great deal to do with change and recovery. You know, what they taught me was that there are some things that you just can't talk your way out of. There are some situations that you can't change anything about. You know, they're just what they are. You know, I had never been that. I always figured I had a choice. I always figured I had a choice. You know, I mean, well, I've got, you know, it's like, well, would you like to do this or would you like to do that? I mean, you're a valued person and we want you to have free choice about what you want to do. Well, I didn't realize that that wasn't a universal concept. I didn't realize that, you know, freedom of movement and freedom of choice wasn't a universal concept. Because when I went there, it took a while, and that a whole point of boot camp was to educate you about this one thing. And the one thing was, there is our way, and then our way, and then our way, and then our way. And they're all the same. And you say, well, I think that we ought to modify this a little bit because I'd be more comfortable if it was, you know, my way plus your way. They didn't buy that, and I just, it takes a while to get used to it. But basically, the basic concept of boot camp is to educate you about the Navy way and to educate you about the fact that there is no real choice. You know, you have to do it this way. You know, there was a Navy way and there's no other way. And I know all the military is like that. There's the Army way and there's the Army way, and that's the way it is. In the Navy, it was the Navy way. And they set it up that way. That's the way it worked. So I went in boot camp, and I soon discovered that was the way. You know, I mean, it wasn't that they didn't even try to persuade. They just simply demonstrated. Oh, you don't want to do it our way? Then there's a thing called non-judicial punishment. Oh, you don't want to do it our way? Okay, you can guard the restroom, the head. You can guard the head for 4 hours in the middle of the night. You don't want to do it our way? Fine. You know, you can guard the restroom in the middle of the night for as long as you decide you don't want to do it our way. Fine. That's good. Oh, you don't want to do it our way? Oh. Your locker is not it's not satisfactory. And they'd tear it apart, and then you'd have to spend hours on your own time, if they gave you any time, to, you know, fold everything exactly right. I remember spending days, you know, them teaching us the exact way to fold our skivvies, our underwear, in the exact way, in a little drawer, and it had to be packed perfectly, exactly according to the way they wanted to do it. You know, I did stuff. No. They've got to be folded, you know, and then, you know, your shoes have to be shined a certain way. You know, everything has to be perfect and ironed perfectly and everything like that. And they say, well, I don't care. They have ways of getting you to care about the way you keep yourself. You know, because not keeping yourself well has consequences. And that was the point of boot camp. Educating you about the consequences of not doing it their way. You say, what does this have to do with recovery? Well, recovery is I don't like recovery, the word, but you know, what all this stuff is about changing our ways of going about things. of changing our reaction to things, of becoming willing to do things we weren't interested in before, so we wouldn't reap the consequences of our foolishness. That's what AA is about. That's what educating you about the consequences of what you do. That's what NA is about. That is what all recovery is about, educating you about the consequences, and to educate you about the way, the things that works and the things that don't. Well, the Navy just told you and taught you there's one way to do it. When you got to the fleet, you learned that it was a little bit different, but they would teach you the same way. You will do it our way, or there will be consequences that you don't want. I mean, you cannot be a better rank. You can get the there's in the Navy and the fleet, there's watches you don't want and there's watches you do want. I mean, it's not a question of whether you're going to stand a watch. Everybody stands a watch. But there are watches you want and watches you don't. And unless you do it their way, you're going to be standing the watches you don't want until you decide that you're going to do it their way. That's military. You ask anybody that's been in the military, and they'll tell you, you basically do it their way. You know what happens? You change. You do it their way because you have to, but in the process of all that stuff, of being in the military and stuff, I didn't like the Navy. You know, the time in the military has marked me. You know, there's a whole bunch of ways that I am and stuff like that are marked by the military. You ask anybody that's been in the military, you know, I made it through. I made it through 6 years in the Navy, and I was honorably discharged and everything. I went through some stuff. I was a drunk. I had captain's mast and stuff like that. But I ended up to learn how to do it their way. And I was sober for the last, year and a half, you know, on antabuse, but I was sober. I learned, and you know, the funny thing is, a lot of the stuff that changed because I had to is still with me. You know, I was a pig, you know, and trust me, the Navy changed that. You know, I reverted in some areas, but in some areas, you know, I just changed. You know, I don't, you know, I can't tolerate things that I used to be able to tolerate. You know, I appreciate and have attitudes that were changed in the military. You know, I appreciate order, and I don't appreciate rebellion and foolishness and stupidity and stuff like that. To a certain extent, that's why sometimes I have trouble. I run a sober house, and sometimes I have trouble because, you know, I just don't like, you know, selfish, self-centered, ridiculous, destructive behavior. I've been in AA. I was sober in AA for a long time. I've been in the church, you know, and, you know, I appreciate people who do it well and do it right, and I don't appreciate people that don't do it well and do it right. And the same thing has worked for the church. In recovery, there were people that they were sloppy, and they were lazy, and they were foolish. And you know the thing about AA, and NA probably too, you know, there's consequences for being stupid, because the consequences are, if you do it sloppy and ridiculous and foolish, inevitably the disease catches up with you and they relapse. You know, and maybe the consequence is they die. So there's a cleanness about it. You know, there is obvious consequences for being foolish and stupid. And I think that I got an appreciation for that in the Navy. You know, so basically, without knowing it, I learned a lot of lessons about change in the Navy. Because, you know, some ways work and some ways don't. And a lot of the things that they teach in the Navy are, this works, this doesn't. This has a consequence, this doesn't. You know, in the Navy, you can get seriously hurt or killed just in a normal routine of doing things in the Navy. You know, everything I worked on in my particular space, every piece of gear I worked on had killed somebody. You know, and you know, they told the story, and I assume they were true. Somebody forgot to use a safety feature, and they were killed. Somebody forgot to do what they're supposed to do, and they got hurt. And in other words, it's reality. The Navy taught me reality. You know, because you just go through things, and they're stupid people, and they're punished, or they do stupid stuff, and then bad things happen, and you hear about it. And it was the same in AA. It's the same in recovery. You know, stupid behavior yields drastic results. You know, if you don't follow the suggestions, which are learned by hard work, you're gonna reap the consequences. You know, in AA it was you'd relapse, and you get an OI, you know, you get drunk driving, or you get something, you know, you'd lose a relationship, you get kicked out of the big bed, you'd do all this stuff. If you kept on doing it forever and ever, you'd probably die sort of a slow, lingering death. In the house that I run now, the sober house, it's a lot of addicts, and the consequences are much more severe. You know, if you don't do the suggestions, and if you're stupid, and if you get yourself in a jam, you know, the consequences can be very, very tragic. You know, everybody I know, you know, will tell me. I have friends with some guys in NA, and I just watch their news feeds, and not a month or two goes by, then there isn't an RIP of somebody they knew, a friend of theirs, that died. I mean, my daughter had a friend, you know, that she knows, who was in the recovery thing, and somebody that we knew, you know, she knew and brought him to the church and stuff like that. Well, this friend brought somebody who's in the program, and she OD'd. She was young, like my daughter. You know, people at, you know, the old church we were going to in the city, you know, I knew this person. I'd helped out. I'd done blah 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 blah. Young lady. She OD'd and died. The consequences of straying off the path are sometimes very, very high. You know, and it's really hard to find your way back. So the Navy taught me that the consequences are for real. They made sure they taught me. You want to do it your way, we're going to do what we do to you. Well, if you're in recovery, no, it's the same thing. Oh, you want to do it your way? Well, the addiction is going to do its way. And you're not going to have any appeal. It's going to hammer you to death. If you're lucky, you survive. So change comes when you come to grips with the fact that there is no other choice. The consequences are just too high. So this particular lesson is about what I learned in the Navy and what I learned in a lot of places. In AA, you know, in 44 years, 45 years of sobriety, you know, in the church and in recovery and in secular programs, you know, the consequences are real. The consequences are very real. And you can change if you look hard at those consequences and decide you don't want to pay the price. Change happens sometimes because you have no other choice. And you set your life up so you have no other choice. You wreck the exit things of recovery. That's what I learned. You set it up so that you have no choice but to stay sober and stay clean. You don't get into relationships that are going to torpedo it. You don't do stuff that everybody says is bad. And you do the stuff that they say is good. And you build barriers to drinking. You're always checking in. You're always, you build barriers to the next drink. You secure yourself from temptation instead of flirting with it like you're flirting with a really bad relationship. Well, a lot of us in addiction and stuff like that, we flirt with really bad stuff. And then we're surprised the morning after when we relapse. And then we try to ignore the fact that, sometimes a relapse doesn't end. For drunks, sometimes a relapse doesn't end. It's not a one-night thing. It's like a 6 months thing, and everything at the end is gone. For people in NA, it's different. Maybe it's a 6 month or a 3 month or a 4 month tear where everything is gone and relationships are gone and everything's gone. You've ruined every relationship you ever know. But a lot of times it ends up abruptly, face down on a street in Worcester, cold as a brick, and young, with no redo. And that's what change is about. Sometimes change happens because you have no other choice. And it's by God's grace that you are terrified and you do what you need to do. That's what changed. The Navy in chains. That's what this little blurb is about. Navy in chains. The Navy in chains. You can't do it your way. You got to do it their way. In recovery, you don't do it your way. You do it their way, because they have many more hours of learning and experience. Don't be stupid. Do it their way and not your way. This is Chuck, Lazarus Recovery